Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good evening, brothers and sisters. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this very important event. We're having a distinguished speaker, Professor Mehmet Ozalp. He's traveled all the way from Australia, just recovering from jet lag. And we're privileged to have, to host the first book launch of his new book, God in Islamic Theology, Tawhid in Classical Islamic Theology, and Sayyid Nursi's Risale-i. We're going to have an evening of a discussion about some of the contents of this book, the new things that Professor Mehmet Ozalp has discovered in this book. It's a journey through Sayyid Nursi's Risale-i to the theological tradition. Maybe we can even call it Kalam Jadid, and just general Islamic theology, as well as Professor Ozalp's journey as well in writing the book, inshallah. So I welcome you all, and let's begin. Welcome, Professor Mehmet.
Thank you very much for having me.
Just going through this book, I must admit I was quite amazed. Firstly, from a few angles, it places Sayyid Nursi in a nice context to put him and appreciate him in a spectrum of scholars within the Kalam tradition, Islamic scholarship from classical times. But it also reminded me a bit of William Chittick's book on Ibn Arabi, where he sort of summarizes his main key thematic theological topics. Did you feel like you were juggling between two, putting him in the scholarly context, yet also presenting him in this book of yours?
Yeah, when I first started, I wanted to do the entire Risale-i and its coverage into a single book. And I have actually went through the entire Risale-i and thematically analyzed it, put it into, because it's not ordered in a particular way, you have to piece it together. And I have identified 13 main topics or fields. So it was going to be impossible to put it all in one book. So I decided to, at the end, just to talk about what does Risale-i say about God, about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But also, I wanted to look at it, is it a continuation of Islamic tradition? Or if so, what scholarly or theological tradition is it following? I wanted to expose also, or mention in this book, the classical theological positions of the previous scholars on these important topics related to God. So basically, look at did Sayyid Nursi make original contributions in this field, and if so, what was his contribution? So that's what I was trying to do. And it turned out pretty good. I'm really happy with the book. I was wondering that myself. You know, I've studied Islamic theology classically. It is a particular field, sometimes too rational, and not everybody likes it. I've read about Sayyid Nursi's books when I was at university, and it really helped me save my faith. You know, I was really struggling with certain aspects of beliefs in Islam. And I really felt indebted to Risale-i for that reason. But I always wanted to investigate how is it situated in the scholarly tradition, and I believe I have done that to some extent. Yeah.
And you're focusing particularly on a lot of what you've just said. It's an excellent introduction. It's going to require a bit of unpacking the school traditions, the theological schools, the dryness of the Kalam tradition that you alluded to, and what was Sayyid Nursi's unique contribution. But I want to go into the heart of the matter. One of the things that I found amazing was you make a very big claim, but quite interesting, that he sort of changes our epistemological understanding. And I'm going to split this discussion about our epistemology inside Nursi's works. But primarily, instead of it being, and I would like to quote you here, that instead of before I quote you, the binary split normally that we hear between the naql and aql, between revelation and the rational use of the mind, It was reframed by Nursi into the naql and universe with the, and I quote you, aql being as the essential instrument that investigates the correlation between the two. So it's aql is taken out of the boxing arena, and it's naql and the universe. You've sort of rephrased that. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, obviously, when I started to do this, I had to have a framework. I wanted to, or a framework to work with, a theoretical framework. And you can't just, sporadically go. I looked at all of the Kalam books written, including Imam Juwayni, up to Imam Ghazali. They do follow, there is a bit of a topical, a framework in the Islamic theology, but I felt that it needed to be fleshed out a little bit, especially related to God. There is a framework generally, it's about God, it's about semiyat, afterlife, and just basic things. But in this one, so basically I had to include epistemology in there. Epistemology is, how do we know what we know? Like, what is the basis of knowledge? It's a very important field, especially considering that in our time, there's science. There's over-reliance on science, empiricism, which Said Nursi himself had to deal with, but the scholars of the classic era, theologians of classic era, did not have to deal with that. For them, the epistemological question was aql and naql. Naql meaning revelation, and like Quran and Sunnah, as we say it, and aql was the reason, pure reason, deductive logic, which a lot of scholars objected to, including Ibn Taymiyyah and others. Wrote even treatises refuting the reason being part of, our sources of knowledge. So for them it was just Quran and Sunnah. But obviously later on, the scholars like Imam Ash'ari, Maturidi have dealt with that topic, where they reconcile between aql and naql, or revelation and reason. And so we had these two Islamic theological schools emerge, the Ash'ari school and Maturidi school, which became the basis of the Sunni theology. And there's an interesting, actually, part about Imam Maturidi. He only covers this in one page in his Kitab al-Tawhid about epistemology, but he does it wonderfully. He does talk about, for him it's Quran, which is the revelation, and mutawatir hadith, and reason. He puts those three as sources, but then he says you need reason to cover all three, or the revelation, because how do you know, how can you distinguish between what is a true revelation and false revelation? You have to have reason. So I think Imam Maturidi had a bit of an inkling there on the role of reason, the overarching role of reason, but Said Nursi does this really very clearly. He went one step forward. So basically for Said Nursi, he says, we have three sources that tells us about our Creator. He says the Quran as the book of revelation, Prophet Muhammad as the prophet of God, and the universe. So putting universe as a source of knowledge, we don't see this in any other theologian before Said Nursi. So because Said Nursi wanted our faith to be based on empirical knowledge and evidence.
Yeah.
Like what we believe to be based on our observation of the universe. And for him, he says this is exactly what Quran does. When Quran says there are signs that we place in this universe for you to think about, for you to contemplate, because this is exactly what Quran is doing. So basically, everybody has, and he doesn't mention reason there, but he uses reason. He says it is the hakim, or the judge that judges between the two. or basically finds a reconciliation between our scientific knowledge and our religious knowledge. But it's not just a reconciliation to make sure that they comply with one another. For him, it's you cannot understand the universe without revelation properly, and you cannot understand revelation without understanding the universe. It's really the complementary and interdependent aspect of those sources that are really important inside Nursi.
So you've said here, thank you, Professor Mehmet, you've said it plays the role of an alat, tool, aql.
Yeah.
But you've also just said it plays the role of a judge. And you've said it doesn't only reconcile, but it sort of is used to show one being evidence or commentary for the other. But the aql. And then you say one sentence that I personally had a difficulty understanding, and I might even take you up on that, maybe challenge if I can. You say here that if reason can confirm Quranic faith propositions with empirical evidence from the universe, then that faith proposition is certain truth. So you almost say that if the Quran proposes something and then reason and empirical evidence from the universe confirms it, then that is deemed a certain truth.
Yeah.
This could be misunderstood. I may have gotten you wrong, but are you saying that, implying that when reason fails to confirm faith propositions with empirical evidence that from the universe, that the Quran proposes, that those Quranic propositions are not certain truths?
But that's not the sentence. That's what you're just putting.
No, I'm quoting you verbatim. I'm quoting you. If reason can confirm Quranic faith propositions with empirical evidence from the universe, then that faith proposition is certain truth.
That's it. That's the.
That's the quote.
Yeah.
So that's referred to as mafhum al-mukhalif in Arabic. You know.
Yeah, well,
are you implying the opposite?
I'm not implying the opposite.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
What that means is that it's this scientific approach.
Yeah.
That. So basically, science works on that premise that you look at the universe, you measure things, and then you explain it, and using your reason, analytic, reasoning, and then you come up with theories, and then you test those theories, and over time, some of those become certain truth, or people believe in them, the conclusions based on that evidence. It may not be absolute, but as we know. In science as well, theories change, explanations change, but it's based on the empirical knowledge. So Sayyid Nursi does the same, which is the Quranic method, as I mentioned earlier, that if you can observe, for example, that there is mercy in the universe, that you can see this mercy everywhere in the natural world, in animals, the way the earth is designed, the way the universe is designed, the way even the physical laws are designed to facilitate life, then there is mercy in this universe. Yeah. And that mercy cannot exist without someone who's merciful. So because it's an attribute. It needs a person, a being, where that has to be attributed to. So then that mercy becomes truth, right? So in that you can believe it as proven through your observations, empirical observations. That's what I mean. Yeah. But obviously if you cannot do that, it's not, the opposite is not true. It's just that you haven't been able to confirm it yet. Or like you can fail to do that task.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Maybe that there's not enough empirical evidence at that stage. Or
exactly. So what I usually try to practice myself and advise my students is that if you cannot understand in any of matters of belief, just park it in your mind. Park it and just continue to learn. Continue to learn. One day you may just understand it. Yeah. With your reason, with evidence, and then it's all right. Sometimes it takes a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, I grapple with, for example, the hadith about, if you do not sin and repent, Allah will create a being who will sin and repent. I grappled with that hadith for a long time. But then I actually discovered that you know, the steel making process, which is, by the way, you know, you dip hot iron in cold water and then beat it up and then repeat that process to produce what they call, you know, optimization, and they actually apply that in even software design and prediction software. You know, this is what we call AI, that is applied. So the way to sometimes get to optimum, sometimes you have to accept something that is less than optimum just to break the cycle. As soon as I learned about that, I understood the hadith.
So the universe helped you understand the scripture there.
Exactly. So in order for human beings to develop, sometimes you have to error, sometimes you have to sin, and then that puts you in a different mindset. You start all over again, and then you improve further. And I guess that was the gist of the hadith. Yeah.
Coming back to epistemology, Professor Mehmet, you mentioned that, and it was really great. You connected that Sayyid Nursi really focuses on these two different books. The book of the universe and the book of the Quran, as you call it. But you highlight that actually other scholars before him have done so as well, like Imam Ghazali, referring to one as Kitab al-Manshur and Kitab al-Mastur. What is the difference here? What's Sayyid Nursi doing that's a bit different to Imam Ghazali? He is treating both of the book of the universe. You attribute one, you quote from him, you say that the Quran comes from Allah's attribute of kalam, attribute of sifa, his ability to speak, while the universe comes from the qudra. Is he really unpacking it and applying it further in a modern epistemology that's needed to battle today's philosophy? What's he doing extra there?
Well, he's making it accessible to contemporary audience in a language that his contemporary audience can understand. I really think that Sayyid Nursi is extremely similar to Imam Ghazali in a lot of ways. Like Imam Ghazali was in politics, he left politics. He was in scholarship, he left scholarship, like being the head of the Nizamiya Madrasa system. And then he wrote something new. He called it Ilm al-Akhirah, you know, that the science of the afterlife, the Ihya Ulumuddin, right? It's Ihya, revival of the religious sciences. And when you read Ihya, it has a very fresh, for its time, very fresh approach and very accessible for common Muslims. It's not overly scholarly, but obviously it's deep. Sayyid Nursi wanted to do exactly the same. He was involved in politics before World War I, he left it. He had this crisis, you know, the both spiritual kind of, they couldn't speak. So Sayyid Nursi, after he goes into a completely different field of like theological writings.
We know of Imam Ghazali's crisis. What's Sayyid Nursi's crisis, like the example of that in his life?
His crisis, well, Imam Ghazali's crisis we know as he couldn't speak, but the real problem was there's a new book, it's called The First Reviver in Islam. In that book, what they talk about is that Imam Ghazali's crisis was he heavily relied on building Islamic like civilization and knowledge in conjunction with politicians. And he invested 20 years of his life working with Nizam al-Mulk and building that madrasa system, but it collapsed when Nizam al-Mulk was assassinated, and then the Seljuk Sultan was assassinated, sent the whole thing in turmoil. Imam Ghazali was caught in between that. He wanted to escape that. So we see similar thing with Sayyid Nursi. He thought that, well, this political, like Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the caliphate collapsed. So what do you do? How do you rebuild all this? And so he was looking for a way forward.
And the madrasas were closed, the Sufi tariqas were closed.
Exactly, there's no more madrasa. Sayyid Nursi wanted to build a madrasa. He called it Madrasatul Zahra in eastern Turkey, northern Iraq. It was going to be another Athar university. And they even laid the foundations, but they couldn't continue. So basically, just as Imam Ghazali put in a single work, Ihya Ulumuddin, everything, and made that accessible to ordinary Muslims, Said Nursi put all his scholarship into Risale-i Nur, and he wrote it in a way that was accessible for ordinary Muslims. And through that, they both wanted to revive religion and faith.
So Risale-i Nur, in a sense, was his madrasa that he...
That's right. He even said, I thought I was going to build this madrasa Zahra, but I now realize that this is the madrasa. It's the blueprint.
Yeah.
Like you can use this and build many madrasas because the approach is the foundation.
Yeah, and in your book you mentioned most books that are authored about a particular scholar, they always say they lived in a very significant time. But the case I think you make is very compelling for Sayyid Nursi. The Khilafat is collapsed. He witnesses 2 world wars. He sees the birth of nation states. The madrasa system, as you said, even the call to prayer has changed. I don't think anyone perhaps can claim to have seen such social and political revolutions.
It was, a lot of scholars felt it was Qiyamah. It was the end of the world that was coming. And I discussed this in detail on chapter 2 of the book, that the scholars around that time, everybody thought, oh, we have to go back to the basics, foundations. And what is the foundation of Islam? Quran. And they all wanted to write a tafsir of the Quran. And you see this with Muhammad Abduh, for example. They started a very detailed tafsir. And he died, his student Rashid Rida continued that. And a lot of the Mawdudi, Sayyid Qutb, like they all write tafsirs of the entire Quran. But nobody reads it, you see, that's the issue. It's not accessible to ordinary Muslims. They don't have
masses
time.
at least don't read it.
The masses, yeah. And Said Nursi wanted to do exactly the same. And he even said, I'm going to do 60 volumes. He started at World War I. Isharatul Ijaz, which is the introduction to that, he did an excellent start. Muhakamat, the introduction, Isharatul Ijaz, first volume. But World War I came. He was captured by Russians. He couldn't continue, and also he realized that's not what people need. But obviously, you still have to base it on the Quran. So what he did was, he put all his revival objectives into a theological explanation of the Quran. He still called his works tafsir, but it's a different types of tafsir. It's the one that focuses on Hakikatul Quran, he called it, the truths of the Quran, which I call like faith propositions of the Quran, which is ultimately the majority of the book is about that.
Yeah. Coming back, Professor Ozalp, about the issue of the 2 books of the universe and the Quran, and Imam Ghazali has alluded to it, but you're saying Sayyid Nursi takes it to a different level.
You see that people no longer have access to that, so he brings it back again to a new audience, fresh audience, with a new language. So he's not reinventing the wheel as such, but I mean, this is the thing about one of the features of what we call Mujaddidi style of writing. Like they re-express Islam in a way that is really self-evident and accessible. Self-evident as in, when people read it, you say, oh yeah, this is Islam that we know. I mean, if you were to write it, you won't be able to write it, but when you read it, you say, it comes across that self-evident, and you accept it straight away. Yeah. Because it's so ingrained into the core of Islam and the Quran. And the language is very important, because otherwise, like I read, like all respect to Muhammad Iqbal, his book on reconstruction of Muslim thought. It's a fantastic piece of work, very good, but very hard to read and understand.
I was just going to ask you.
I had to read it twice, and still I don't remember everything about the book. I mean, it goes into a lot of philosophy, Bergson and Western philosophers, refutes them. And the thing is, ordinary Muslims don't need that. They just need the foundations of, does God exist? How do we understand existence of God? How do we understand Tawhid? Afterlife, like what is afterlife? Is there a proof? And this is one of the things about Sayyid Nursi. He's the only one, even Ghazali didn't attempt this. He's the only one that attempted to prove existence of afterlife.
And he calls that a Quranic way, his way. He refers this to, in terms of his proof for Tawheed and spirituality, which we'll get into. But just while you're at the resurrection, he calls that a Quranic. How is that a Quranic way, his proof for the afterlife?
Because Quran is full of arguments, rational arguments. At the end of Surah Yasin, there are 4 proofs there of afterlife. In one of 10th word in his book, which is all about proving resurrection, he quotes at the beginning the verse from the chapter 30, verse 50, where it says, "Look upon the creation of God's mercy, how He gives life to earth after its creation. So will be your recreation, and God is more powerful over all things." This verse I put in my logic class, and I want students to analyze the logical argument behind it. A lot of people struggle with that because I guess the verse is put in it's not put in that logical way. But when you reconstruct it, it's a very powerful, sound, logical argument there. So basically, Sayyid Nursi takes that single verse and writes 50 pages on it.
Proving the hereafter.
Proving the afterlife. And he basically goes, he said, empirically, observations about the universe. For example, very quickly, I gave the example of mercy. He says, well, there's all these things in it shows there's mercy, and the mercy has to have someone who's merciful. And then he says, since there is a merciful creator, if there was no afterlife, it's not consistent with mercy. Because it's like letting a kid taste chocolate and then say, oh, you will never have chocolate again. You know, it would actually be cruel to let us taste this life existence and then make us die forever, not to revive us again. It's cruelty, he says. So there must be, if God is merciful, there must be afterlife. So, I mean, he goes on this a lot.
By that, it's a Quranic argument, but it's a very based on the universe because of the universal mercy that he calls the reader to witness.
Well, it's based on empiric because he starts with that, but he's developing a theology here as well. It's very original. It's a theological proof of afterlife. You know,
which almost, if I could, is he sort of saying, because normally hereafter is put, as you mentioned earlier, in the Sami'iyat chapters of theology, meaning that there's no majal for aql, there's no room for aql, you just hear and obey, and you believe in it. Is Sayyid Nursi taking a lot of these previously thought topics that were just believe and obey, almost blind seeing? We're not talking about God's existence, but things about the hereafter. And because of this universal epistemological emphasis of his, giving it a bit of more rational justification. Is that what's happening?
Yes, in the classic theologian tradition, the reason is there very much at the start. They start with existence, non-existence. And from that they go, there's a necessary being. And this being has to have certain attributes, like speaking, and then this God gives revelations. But and then you can test that revelation is true by certain evidence. But once you're satisfied the revelation is true, you abdicate reason to revelation. So reason becomes subservient to revelation after that point. That's where it stops. Well, with Sayyid Nursi, he continues on to the entire theology.
Pillars of faith, the other pillars of faith.
Exactly. So,
okay. Moving on to beliefs in the God's existence, which is one of the main themes of your book, and his oneness. Now, I noticed something, and you know, you sort of list and you describe and you analyze Sayyid Nursi's proofs for the existence of God, and then separately you look at his proofs for the existence of, for God's oneness. And while sort of comparing and contrasting to the Ilm al-Kalam proofs for the same things, You mentioned sort of that Sayyid Nursi does quote those kalam arguments, but you use the words reluctantly, and in another place you use characteristic aversion of purely logical and philosophical arguments, both to prove God's existence, which is the hudus imkan, and also God's oneness. Why this reluctance? Why is he not depending on those kalam arguments?
The classic kalam arguments for existence of God are huduth and imkan arguments. I won't go into that, but Sayyid Nursi sees it. He says, he gives this analogy. He says, the kalam approach is like, imagine you need water, right? The kalam approach brings water from a distant lake by laying all these pipes, you know, and then the water comes to you eventually. That's very expensive, very time-consuming. But he goes, Quran digs a hole where you are right now and brings water from the ground directly.
Almost with the staff of Moses type analogy.
Exactly. So this is why, this is his main criticism of Kalam methods. It's a methodology. He's not criticizing the entire theological field, because he is ultimately a theologian, but he's critical of the methods and over-reliance on logical, proofs, argumentation. But he is providing logical arguments, but he usually does that with drawing analogies or drawing our attention to the universe, the things that we know of the universe.
Which I guess is also very Quranic, with the use of analogies from the universe. Yeah. You mentioned in the proofs of God's existence, not only does he give the traditional ones, but he gives a lot of new proofs for God's existence, but he also goes into what you call default proof, by showing that God's non-existence is as impossible. And is that something unique to him that you've seen from Muslim theologians?
Well, that's his original contribution to that particular field of proofs of God's existence, is the default argument, I called it, and several other scholars recognize that as well currently.
Could you unpack that for us?
The default proof is basically, he starts by saying that this universe requires an explanation. Like the fact that there is existence rather than non-existence, there's a universe rather than nothing. So he says so far, this belief has brought three arguments: existence by itself, and by causes and by nature. Then he says, if we can show, and the fourth explanation is that there is a creator. So he says, if we can show that these three explanations are wrong or false or impossible, then the fourth explanation, that God has created everything, becomes true by default. So that's why it's called default argument. So he does provide directly evidence of God's existence, but in this approach, he's refuting every other explanation as impossible. And then he goes on and gives a very detailed, arguments why they are impossible, and which are really convincing to a critical reader.
And by him saying it's impossible, he means it's logically impossible. All those other, it's muhal, absolutely muhal.
Muhal, but also he says by doing this, you end up accepting number of gods to the number of atoms in the universe. Basically, some of his arguments are, if you don't accept a creator who's all-knowing, then every particle has to be all-knowing, because they are interconnected, they relate to everything else. An atom knows how to behave in your eye, how to behave in somewhere else. Well, then where does this knowledge come from? And by the way, some of these arguments, the sciences really come up, like the fact that there is information in the universe is a big field at the moment in theoretical physics. There's something called conservation of information. What we call knowledge, I guess the science calls it information. So basically for Sayyid Nursi, it's either you accept one God, or you end up accepting by default many gods.
You're almost bound to believe in something.
Exactly.
And from my personal readings, this is something that really stood out for me. You're going to believe anyway. You're going to choose the more rational, easier approach, or the more one that has more rational difficulties. And I think he applies this for other things as well. Just every faculty being given, you got to preserve it somehow. Either use it in the right way, or you end up using it. Speaking of belief, Professor Ozalp, we have, as you know, the greatest, fastest growing religion is atheism and agnosticism. Mostly a Muslim crowd likes to hear Islam and they say takbir. But it is actually agnosticism and atheism. And the two different currents, and if I'm not mistaken, Sayyid Nursi also touches on qabul adam and adam qabul.
Yes.
Is that something unique to him, and how would you just...
I wanted to put a chapter on that as well, but I just ran out of time.
I wish you did. Maybe an upcoming article.
On belief, like he has a lot of good, really interesting discussions on belief. Yes, he does distinguish between the two approaches, like agnosticism and atheism. For him, atheism is something there's a conviction that there is no God.
Qabul Adam.
No, Adam Qabul. Yeah, Qabul Adam. Where you are accepting non-existence. But Adam Qabul, he means there's lack of acceptance. So that's what we call agnosticism. And that people haven't really made up their minds. There's no conviction. They're just confused. Probably because of the atheistic trends in society, they may incline towards that. Or maybe I shouldn't say atheistic, but this antagonism towards religion in general. People don't like organized religion anymore. I think this is where Islam has advantage. I was just last week in a dialogue session in Australia where this topic came up. Christianity, for example, relies a lot on the church institutions and structures, Catholicism especially, and the beliefs of like the faith propositions are. You have to accept Jesus died for your sins. Like you can only argue that from the scriptures, not from necessarily reason. I'm not criticizing this. I'm just laying out as a fact that Islam does have some advantage because you can practice religion individually without necessarily a mosque. Mosque is just an instrument, just something that brings people together. An organization serve that, and the Islamic beliefs are natural theology, so which Sayyid Nursi really take advantage. And Quran is a natural theology, so it makes sense, or it can make sense. You can have some rational explanation, arguments that it's based on knowledge and reason. And I think this is one of the, somewhere Sayyid Nursi says, I have two aims with all these writings, two aims. One is to show that, because in our time, disbelief comes from knowledge or science, scientific knowledge. Like people are not ignorant anymore, they're educated, and their education seems to lead them to disbelief. This was not the case in the past. So you have to now come up, defend faith through knowledge and evidence and science and knowledge of the universe. That's why he's going down that path. Because the second one, he says, I want to show that there is a spiritual hell in disbelief.
In this world.
In this world. Not delay hell. Yeah, there is afterlife hell, like he covers that, but he doesn't talk about it in detail, but I guess he wants to show that there is the inner hellish existence and pain, spiritual pain that people go through if they don't believe. Because I want to highlight that and show that in faith you'll have peace and inner peace and get rid of that pain. So basically show that we need religion in this life as to guide us on this planet.
I have a few different questions for each chapter, but we are a bit short with time, and I will start slowly open the floor for anyone that wants to ask questions, but I have a list of questions. So if you don't have questions, don't feel worried. I have questions coming on. Particularly, The amazing thing that I think that you bring and highlight in this book, that theology, at least based on Sayyid Nursi, is not just those, what you said before, dry or pure rational kalam texts. He brings in knowing God and ma'rifat. And you were saying to me as well before that that is perhaps one of the most unique contributions of theology. Some have commented that, you know, Imam Ghazali and Ibn Arabi also did something similar, where they realized, look, a lot of the debates that the theologians were having was not meant to be in the books of theology. It was meant to be in the lived experience of religion, or in Gnosticism, or some sort of mysticism. How does Sayyid Nursi connect Ma'rifah? What's his main theological approaches to Ma'rifah?
That's a very important question, and thrust of the book. As I said at the beginning, I first laid out a theoretical framework for theology, or for study of theology in modern times. And one of the issues that I came to, like with the classic Kalam theology, is that it doesn't include Ma'rifah, or knowledge of God. It just discusses some fundamental attributes or sifat of God, like, you know, knowledge, life, self-subsistence, and things like that. The 14 attributes of God.
If I'm not mistaken, some of them were somewhat inspired by Greek philosophy as well, in some way or the other.
Well, let's not get into that,
Okay,
but that's a different topic.
Okay.
I'm not going to say yes or no, but so it kind of stops there. But when we look at the Quran, it's full of names of Allah. Like, yes, sifat are driven from the names, but it focuses on Asma'ul Husna. So theologians did not pick this up in the past, because they were mainly focused, they left that to the Quran, or they thought it wasn't the concern of theology. But the Sufis did. Like, Sufism picked it up on names of God, especially Ibn al-Arabi and others. Imam Ghazali wrote a book on all of the 99 names. But the thing with Sufism, though, is that it's very highly speculative and like subjective as well. It's not based on reason, evidence, or not sometimes even not based on Quran, or it can really go off track, and that's why that was one of the, like, kashf source of knowledge that was debated, and Imam Ghazali said yes. Sayyid Nursi doesn't bring that in; he sees it subjective too. But what Sayyid Nursi did...
Doesn't he say, sorry to cut you, many parts of the Risale, it was said to me, it was... Doesn't his language allude to a sort of kashf, and wouldn't some of the truths of Risale, according to some, might be Sayyid Nursi's kashf?
It's not a kashf based on spiritual experience, it's based on ilham. It's inspiration that you get, like when you study, when you labor your brain, and all of a sudden a thought comes to you, some explanation comes to you, understanding, you come to an understanding. That's what it means.
So how do you distinguish between ilham and kashf? I've never thought of that, to be honest.
Well, kashf is spiritual experience. Like, you have to worship God, go make zikrullah, go into a spiritual state and experience where certain things will be revealed to you.
You experience it.
You experience it,
It's
yes.
not just an abstract thought that's inspired to you.
It's not thought, yes.
Okay.
And the difficulty with that is, how do you put that into writing, a rational thought or proper language, which is what Ibn al-Arabi's problem was, or a lot of people had problems with Ibn al-Arabi, because you can't put experience into words that easily. So what Sayyid Nursi did was, he expanded scope of theology to include Asma'ul Husna and Ma'rifatullah, but up to the point that Quran allows. And for that reason, sometimes they see him as a Sufi, but he's not a Sufi. But he does bring those Sufi topics into, or traditionally what was Sufi topics, the Ma'rifatullah, into the scope of theology, which I think fits really well, because basically there are three questions that a religion has to answer about God. Does God exist? Is God one? or many, how do I relate to God? Ultimately, these are the three fundamental questions, which I talked about in the first chapter as the main framework of my approach as well. And I think that Said Nursi fits perfectly in that, his works. It's also Quranic. So therefore, I feel it's proper Islamic theology, the scope of Islamic theology must include knowledge of God and that is through the names and names of God.
But you also highlight his concept, his tafsir of the verse of God giving the amana to the mountains and the trees, and they're all rejecting it, and him saying that it's the human ego or ana. His ma'rifah sort of comes down to that sort of ambiguous ana concept, whether it really exists, doesn't exist, but it somehow is very critical in his ma'rifat.
Well, you touched on a very good point. 31st word in his the book Words. He puts human ana or self-awareness or consciousness at the center of understanding God, because he says ana is like a unit of measurement. Like we understand things by comparing one to another, or using some things as unit of measurement. Like what is the distance from here to San Francisco? 5 hours flight, 1,000 kilometers, whatever. Like we always have to describe it with units of measurement. But God is infinite. It's not part of the universe. So how do we relate to God? How do we understand?
How do you measure the infinite? Yeah.
So human being actually becomes the unit of measurement. Like the fact that we have knowledge, but to a limited degree we understand that God is knowing. We have mercy, but to a limited degree we understand infinite mercy of God through those. Even he says, for example, the fact that you have ownership, like you can produce artistic things. You understand that creativity of God, that God owns everything through those. But the key question here is that the key objection to this is we are projecting our own selves to God, like anthropomorphizing God, they call it. But the answer to that is, and Said Nursi's approach, if you can confirm these attributes in the universe as well, then it's not subjective. You're not projecting yourself onto God. It's there.
Obviously, also with the guidance of the Quran and Sunnah,
the Quran,
and theological beliefs about God.
Exactly, and Quran guides you by, for example, in a verse it says, God sends down rain from the sky to produce green earth. He's Latif and Khabir. Like a lot of the verses in the Quran finishes with names of God. They're not there just as a nice addendum. It's there to show that in these events that you see rain and coming down, greening, you see attributes of God, these Latif and Khabir coming out. Yeah. And even in social settings, like what happens to prophets, names of gods are mentioned. So basically through these we understand, we can get clues about God's names, Asma al-Husna. And Said Nursi does this in two ways, which he calls Ahadiyya and Wahdaniyya, which I talked about in the chapter about Tawhid. Like you can appreciate God's names in a Wahdaniyya way where it's across, you see it across the entire universe. Al-Adl, like balancing, this act of balancing you see everywhere in the universe from galaxies to the atoms. But also on single things, you see multiple names appearing. He calls that Ahadiyya, or manifestation of Ahadiyya, God's uniqueness. And he explains this with the example of a flower where he identifies 19 names of God on a single flower. So it's really interesting, very, very thought-provoking.
You can almost see the influence of Sir Ahmad Farooq Sirhindi, where some of these very subtle words, normally it's not distinguished in Islamic being wahdan and ahdaniya. Definitely you see those influence of those early mujaddids on Sayyid Nursi.
I really think there's a continuum there, like between Imam Ghazali, Ahmed Sirhindi, and Sayyid Nursi. They are very similar.
Could we add Ibn Arabi as well?
Well, Ibn Arabi, there is theology before Ibn Arabi and after Ibn Arabi. There is Islamic spirituality before Ibn Arabi and after. He has a big impact, but he's not the mujaddidi type, like the type that I'm talking about, where
they have an Ihya project.
The main aim is Ihya of the masses.
Mm-hmm.
They're concerned about reviving religion in the ordinary Muslims, ordinary people. They're not worried about scholars or making scholarly contribution. They do by default, but the Ibn al-Arabi is elitist.
Perhaps the elitist, or he's really just seeking the ultimate truth for himself. And
his journey, his writings take spirituality into new realms. I mean, he made huge contribution there.
But we do find Sayyid Nursi referring to Imam Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, and Ahmad Farooq Sirhini quite often throughout the Risale-i, don't we?
He does. He's a bit critical of Ibn Arabi, the Wahdatul Wujud concept.
Of that concept, but he defends it, that it's not pantheism and so on.
He doesn't accuse him of error or deviancy.
He calls him my ustad, my teacher, and maybe that's a different discussion.
That's right.
The influence of Ibn Arabi. I said that the only reason why I ask is because from my readings of Risale-i Nur was very interesting. But when opening books like Fusus al-Hikam, that the universe is a reflection of God's names and God created everything to witness himself and for others, I was just so surprised to see an Ibn Arabi influence in a very positive way on the Risale-i Nur. I'm aware that I think some of our listeners will have some questions, but I do have one or two dying questions. So particularly about causality. We can't not talk about theology and God without touching on causality.
Big topic, that one.
Big topic. Now,
maybe we can come back to that if there's no questions.
All right, how about we do the habit? If we have some questions, I'll open up the floor. Anyone here, please feel free to just put your hands up and ask your questions, and maybe if it's not heard, I can rephrase it. In relation to Professor Ozalp's book, God in Islamic Theology, or the contents of what he said.
I guess you haven't had a chance to see the book, so you're at a disadvantage there. It's just came out actually, just off the print. Last week I received copies of the book, and so I brought several copies here. But you'll be able to order online if you're interested. I'm not saying it because I wrote it, but I honestly think that this book is a very important contribution to understanding of God in contemporary times, and ultimately religion is about God.
Well, I guess I got a bit of time. Coming to causality, Professor Ozalp, now this is a big question, because there's that one sentence of Sayyid Nursi that, for me, it answers so many questions. His God's dignity requires that, things be attributed to causes, yet the secret of his Tawhid requires that it's always given to him.
Yeah.
But Sayyid Nursi must be placed in a Kalam tradition of Ash'ari's approach to causality, Maturidi approach, and then this whole issue of occasionalism that comes with it. Is it really Imam Ghazali? Does he have it? Is Sayyid Nursi a defender or think in that way? Or is his approach to causality very different? Could you just give us a bit, in a summary form, what are the unique approaches towards causality by Sayyid Nursi?
Look, I tried to actually position Sayyid Nursi in Ash'ari or Maturidi. I was really interested to see where he can be placed. I mean, he doesn't openly say it himself. But I feel that he is closer to Maturidi school than Ash'ari school. He doesn't, in Ash'arism, there is atomism and occasionalism very distinctive. He doesn't go into those at all. And in the Maturidi school, there's Maturidi has this very important explanation of hikmah of God. Like hikmah dominating God's actions in this universe, it's very much inside Nursi's writings. So it's everywhere. And so I really feel that Nursi is closer to Maturidi, but he's too original to be placed in a school, I feel, as well. So in terms of causality, which is a very important, it was a big topic in the classic tradition, and some Ash'ari school rejected it completely. Maturidi school accepted it with conditions, like, you know, God being ultimately behind everything. It's sort of accepted, but some the whole topic relies on do things have natures? The natures like tab that makes you do things and on their own, or is everything driven directly by God? Like every atom moves by God's order and command, or, you know, do things have some sort of agency in what they do? So in Ash'ari theology, things don't have anything. It's all completely God's making. So that leads to the occasionalism idea that, like, this entire universe is recreated at every moment. It's destroyed and recreated.
And that famous phrase that we hear, it's not the knife that cuts, it's not the fire that burns. Does that also describe, I mean, you say here, and I quote you, you say one of Nursi's unique contributions in the field of causality is, an original contribution of Nursi is in showing the ineffectiveness of causality is his main argument that an effect has far greater value than the sum of all causes required to create it.
That's right. That's the, like Said Nursi doesn't reject causes, but he doesn't attribute creation to causes completely. He says basically his main argument is that there's always a gap. Like whenever something happens, when we think like some things come together to produce something, whenever that happens, there's always a creative gap. Like the causes themselves don't add up. What they bring don't add up what's produced. You know, like for example, sodium is a highly flammable atom, like metal. Oxygen is highly burning. Sorry, chlorine is a poisonous gas. You bring the sodium and chlorine together, you produce salt that we desperately need in our bodies. Like, how does it work, you know? So, like, how do you get that effect from these poisonous and highly flammable things?
And given that that's such a critical ingredient for life and for all the species,
exactly,
the overall effect cannot be explained by the causes.
Exactly. Said Nursi gives like examples that can make sense to ordinary people.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, he sometimes says even like what is the ultimate cause? Human beings. Even, he says, human beings, like the things that we do, fundamentally, we're not in control of.
Like eating. Huh?
Like eating, even thinking, he says, like thinking, like you have no control of your brain. And it's just a tool. But what this brings is, like when you say there is no causes, then God becomes involved in everything. And then Said Nursi says that this introduces, like a lot of people think that, that's impossible for one being to govern everything, or we think of it as hard, you know, difficult or unnecessary. So something that is highly original to Said Nursi is he discusses how easy it is to create, like do things in this universe.
With unity.
Like he gives these principles, which are included in the chapter for Tawhid, which really makes sense. For example, he says, you can't, like a sane person can move a single boat or a big ocean liner by the same force. But what is the difference? Like the big ocean liner, you just turn the steering wheel, But because there's like mechanisms and systems in place that translate that little movement to this massive force that moves the big ocean liner, like a lot of like heavy things happen with little force. He says, well, with one command and one action, because there are systems in place created by Allah on this world, things happen very quickly and what seemed difficult to us can happen very easily. Or he says, if you put a light source in the center of the room and there's mirrors everywhere, that same light source appears on every mirror at the same time. There's no difficulty in that because light is omnipresent. And so in a similar way, like God's power is omnipresent. It permeates everything. Like every atom responds to God's power. I mean, you can even argue this theoretical physics at the moment.
Well, thank you much, Professor Ozalp. I feel like I want to reread sections or the whole book again. And maybe if there are things that I get stuck on, you might expect some messages or some quick things. I want to again ask if there are brothers and sisters, if you want to ask anything, please feel free. We have some, I can recognize, distinguished guests and also very competent readers of the Risale-i Nur here as well.
Sorry we missed part of the talk. We got caught in the getting here. So my question maybe doesn't require a theological answer. It may be a more practical. You mentioned the category of disbelief. You know, there are people, agnostic, atheists. So there's the category of people that call themselves the SPNR, spiritual but not really. This is also a very growing population, especially on education institutional. So is your book is something, since I haven't read it, can help those people, and what category would you put them in? People who say they're spiritual but not religious.
Okay. In Australia, Australian census covers these religious questions. They ask what religion do you belong to, and there's a category of atheism and no religion. The atheism is very small, 0.1% pick atheism, but 30% of the population, biggest block, picks no religion. So they don't classify themselves as atheists, but I mean, we don't have any more information than that, but I guess they believe in something. They want to be spiritual. They realize that life, an explanation of the universe, existence, purpose of life would be blank without some sort of spirituality. But they're disillusioned by organized religion, particularly institutions that represent religion, and the mistakes that they do. Like whenever religion is represented by some authority, it goes backwards. Like even Islam, like Islam spread in the 1st century to a very large geography. But that was really futuhat, it's opening those territories to Islam. The conversion took a long time. It's only when in 10th century the central caliphate collapsed, masses started to convert to Islam. Like that's how it works, unfortunately.
Ironically, the political power of Islam is inversely proportional to the spirit of Islam, you could argue.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like people like to make an explanation that makes sense to them, and a spiritual way that will fulfill them in this life and will answer their questions and settle their heart. We think, well, Islam provides that, but an Islam that is what kind of Islam, you know? So if you really go to certain places, talk to certain scholars or sheikh, mashayikh, the way they explain it, you don't like religion after that, and that's the problem with it. And I think Sayyid Nursi, I saved my faith. You know, I was struggling with faith when I was in university. I mean, I grew up, when I was 10 years old, I started to pray 5 times a day. I started fasting in Ramadan, 10 years old. Nobody asked me. I did it by myself. I went to mosque. It just came natural to me, a religion. But that was just, that natural thing went so far, you know, once you get these knowledge, philosophies, alternative explanations, you get confused, you know, the doubts creep in. You know, thankfully, only when I got access to Said Nursi's material, like I read his books in 1 month, and it was on a business trip actually, just after university. And when I came back, like I honestly, I'm not sort of glorifying myself, but just to show the effect. When I came back, people said, "You've changed. Your face is glowing." You know, honestly, after I realized that it disappeared, but I actually felt that because I got rid of all those doubts. I answered my question, so faith entered my heart, and then that light of faith radiated from my face. The people could see it. And that's the kind of effect Said Nursi's writings had on me. So I'm indebted to it. I really feel like, honestly, if you don't have a firm foundation, like a core in faith in Islam, that is really based on sound argument and proves conviction, your faith is always shaky. It can be, people usually, what they do is what Muslims do, the Muslims that I've observed, in order to save their faith, they go into a dualism. They create a dualistic life for themselves. Ironically, they say Islam is not dualistic, you know, not secular, but they end up doing that. They split knowledge. This is science, so this is not Islamic, you know. They live in a bubble in order to preserve their faith. Or those who cannot do that, who are just too intellectually curious and want to know answers, want to know what is truth, they're confused, they get doubts, and some people are driven to atheism if they don't have answers. So I feel that writings of Said Nursi, which I laid out in this book about God, about Allah, gives you that confidence to go out there and be exposed to anything, and you can be safe in your faith. So you don't have to create that dualism that I talked about.
Can I just, thank you for sharing a bit of that personal journey. You said you read it after those uni years, and I assume that's 10 years ago, since your spiritual glow. But in terms of, so you've been studying and teaching, and I've personally benefited, as you know, from your projects on Risale-i back in Australia. Writing this book, what changed? What did you learn from this experience of writing this book on God and Islam, with your relationship with Said Nursi and Risale-i?
Well, I haven't learned anything new about Risale-i, but I was able to compare and contrast him to the classical Muslim scholarship on theology. So basically, well, I discovered where he sits. I discovered his originality in this respect. And he's firmly rooted in, you know, scholarship, Islamic scholarly tradition, but he's making his own contributions. And the reason for that is, like, theology, which I defined in this book as well. Like, theology is everything everything about, either directly about God or related to God, that you try to understand, like rationally, and it needs to be rooted in scriptures, but also respond to the issues and questions a particular time and place raises. It's always been that case. You know, for example, today we never talk about is Quran created or uncreated, but that was a big issue in you know, 8th century and 9th century. But in our time, there are other bigger problems that scholars in the past did not face.
And it's not being spoken about.
And it's not being covered. And this is a big problem in the Muslim world. A lot of people are focusing on fiqh, like Islamic law, and they feel reviving that will bring Muslims back. Or they're focusing too much on politics They want a political leader to come and fix everything. They're banking all the hopes in politicians, which you're bound to be, disappointed. Or some sort of a Quranic tafsir. I mean, ordinary Muslims don't do that, but some scholars. So anything related to Quran is great, but it needs to be like Quran is, which I also talk about. I mentioned in the book that, like when you look at the four main themes in the Quran, it's about God, about afterlife, stories of prophets, and also about the individual practices, worship, and obligations and so on. Like, even if you go with that, like 75 to 80% of the book is purely theological. So to understand Quran properly, you have to engage in theology.
Yeah.
But we do that. The problem is when you say that, people think you need to go back, read all these theological books written 1,000 years ago. No, you don't do that. That's why I wrote, I guess I brought inside Nursi basically to show it as a case that it can be done in our time. And he's done a great job, I think.
There have been some, you've been in interviews as well, some common new projects about this Kalam al-Jadid type initiative where it's trying to compare, I think, let's say scholars like Imam Maturidi and some of the European philosophers. How do you place Sayyid Nursi?
I support that, but I think they have to engage with Sayyid Nursi. Like when you say Kalam al-Jadid now and you don't read Sayyid Nursi, talk about him, like it's...
Because you see him as the century.
Well, he's written thousands of pages on this. And it comes from the classical, scholarly tradition. After that, after his generation, it kind of broke.
Yeah.
So he's our connection to that past in terms of theology and modern contemporary times.
Yeah, just reading some pages.
I don't want to limit like theology just to that, but there's no other contemporary scholar, like modern era, in the last 100 years or so, that's written on theology in a significant way.
And yet...
So if you're talking about like reviving theology, then you have to read Sayyid Nursi.
Yeah. And the sad thing is, you highlighted, was after the stagnation of theology, we actually expect there to be more contributions from Muslim philosophy.
Exactly.
But there somehow hasn't really.
There are massive questions, like quantum physics introduces so many issues. Just to tell you, like the free will. Free will is a big theological question of the classical era. Sayyid Nursi deals with that too. There is a research going on, which has been going for 5 years, invested $60 million. Scholars in science, philosophy, and theology are involved. They're just investigating free will. Does it exist or not? What is its role? Like,
where is that research being hosted, man?
I mean, Muslims are not doing it, right?
So once you say 60 million, I realize that.
Yeah. Like these are massive investments. Like Muslims have to invest in this field. Like, I really feel falling behind.
Maybe Muslims can provide the building for that. I think 60 floors of this. Yes, we have something from Professor Zuleyhat.
Thank you very much, Sadiq Hocam, for giving me a chance to ask my question.
I apologize.
Thank you very much, Professor Ozalp. It's a great pleasure to see that a book about God, the concept of God, and some questions came out as a scholarly book. And I'm just wondering, since I haven't seen the book, my questions are about the book. So how relevant is Risale in today's academic circles, outside of the Islamic theological circles? And what does this book can be considered, and can we consider this book as a bridge to connect with these circles outside of Islamic theology in academia? That's my first question. The second one is,
outside of Islamic theology for who? Muslims, non-Muslims? What do you mean?
I mean, regardless whether or not they are Muslims, but outside of theological circles, do you think this book can, contribute or communicate with the world
outside of, those who are not familiar.
Okay.
Amongst the lay people, I think.
No, academic circles.
Oh, academic circle.
Yeah, that's my first question. The second one is, what are some intellectual challenges that you have come across while writing this book?
Intellectual challenges.
Yes.
Okay, whether Said Nursi and his writings are outside of theological circles, obviously it's a highly theological writing, so it concerns theology first. But there has been a lot of these Risale-i Nur conferences, symposiums in the last 20 years or so, and many books are written, articles, scholars from around Muslim world and non-Muslim scholars of religion covered it. And a lot of like sociology of religion is involved in this, because ultimately Said Nursi was a leader of a movement as well. So it created a sociology and an effect on society in Turkey, primarily, and the movements that come from Turkey, but also spread across the Muslim world to inspire other leaders. They don't always openly quote him, but they're influenced by him, his approach. Like his emphasis on education, his emphasis on dialogue, intrafaith dialogue, interfaith dialogue, non-violence, like highly progressive and beyond his time.
Non-political.
Non-political. He clearly says Islam should not be mixed with politics because it damages Islam itself. I mean, it's not like a theoretical separation. For him, it's a protection of religion. And he says if you take religion with politics, for example, it's like using a sledgehammer to do a subtle, exercise, because it comes with a big force, and people will always doubt your sincerity when you're taking a message and mixed with politics. So he has many objections to that, which political Islam was a very big, influence in the Muslim world. So I really think his movement is beyond just theology, definitely. Was studied and should be studied. But when I actually started this research, I actually found that he's taking too much out of theology. And I wanted to bring him back to theology because that's his biggest contribution and most important benefit that he can provide. Like to a point that, like there were about 20 books, like conference proceedings. None of them had Said Nursi's discussion on God. None of the papers or chapters and books. There was like more than 300 books in Turkish. None of them talked about. I was amazed, and that's why in the end, before I started, I wanted to cover everything, but that he wrote about. But in the end, I decided to stick it to. It was becoming too big of a task. Like I think you would at least need like 6 volumes. I have to write 6 books to completely cover his thought and writings.
Can we?
Assalamu alaikum. I was just wondering if Sayyid Nursi or any other scholar in your book discussed the idea of utopia or the perfect society. Is it possible on this planet to have that? And is there any Arabic word that describes that?
Utopia. He doesn't really talk about that. He doesn't create a utopic vision for society. He's a realist. Like he understands that humans are weak, like ultimately, and that prone to making mistakes and errors. So I really think that he's a realist. He's got writings, letters to his students, which are really important. I think they also needs to be studied particularly in reference to your question.
And translated, we don't have them in English.
They're not translated. Yeah, they're extremely important just to really give his motives, what he was advising his students. And he doesn't really create he talks about a process like Iman, kind of Iman life, he calls it like kind of you have to start with the foundations of, like, if you're going to revive a society, you got to start with Iman, the faith, which he says, I'm doing that right now. He goes, but this is one person, one lifetime is not enough. Because the next stage is you bring everything into life. So basically, you got to see the hayat, like Iman, hayat, shariat, he calls it, the third stage. But the shariat is not like the Islamic law as we understand it, but kind of like an Islamic society or system where the principles and ideals of Islam are reflected, you know, in kind of in world order. I mean, that's as idealistic he gets, I think.
We'll just take one last question from Dr. Suleiman.
Thank you for this beautiful presentation. Recently, Dr. Adnan Aslan, our Dean of Academics, he made an interview with Sayyid Hussein Nasr. And in that interview, he quoted one sentence from Risale-i, which is, it is not the time of Sufi tariqa, but it is the time of haqiqa. Maybe you could translate it as reality. And when he kind of asked from Sayyid Hussein Nasr to comment on this statement, Nasr said, you know, Nursi is completely wrong on this. He wants to reach without a means. He wants to reach God without a means. Meaning that Sufi tariqa is the only means for, you know, that's the implication basically. So what would you say on this?
Yeah.
And what does really Nursi mean with that statement?
Yeah, Nursi talks about that in letters, his book Letters. By the way, Nursi was qualified to teach Sufism, both in Qadri and Naqshbandi lines, but he chose not to.
Was it also not legal for him to do so as well?
Yeah, I'm going to call it,
Okay,
like,
sorry.
he does kind of justify theoretically why, and also there's a practical component to that. Like theoretically, he says there's two types of sainthood. The one is direct access, one through a means. I think that's what Sayyid Hussein Nasr is stuck on, that he sees that only through means you can get to. But whereas Sayyid Nursi says it's the Sahaba method, Sahaba way was direct access rather than going through the means. And if it's possible for Sahaba, then it's possible for us. Yes, we don't see the Prophet ﷺ, but if we follow their same method, we can do it. And he calls the two differences as akrabiyya and qurbiyya. Like qurbiyya is getting close to God through Sufism, like you go on a journey, basically, spiritual journey. But akrabiyya is you realize that God is already close to you. And he gives an analogy with the sun. He goes, you can have access to sun, either travel, you know, fly with a spaceship, or you realize that sun is already there, stroking with its light and heat on your arm. You just don't realize that it's there. The light is coming to us already. So he says that these books that he's written gives you that direct access to Quran's light and haqiqah. Like you don't discover haqiqah through kashf, like you have to go experience this spiritual development and you discover it. You can discover it through knowledge, through, as he said, digging a hole directly at the bottom rather than bringing water from kilometers away. I think that was his approach. Like practically also, he realized that I mean, one of his main transformations in Istanbul in 1920 is when he reads Keshful Qulub by Abdul Qadir Jilani. He goes, it did an operation on me, on my heart. I could only read half of it, then he leaves it, he comes back, because it was too painful. Then he comes back and reads the entire book. He goes, it fixed everything. Like you can see he's benefiting from these sources, but after 1923, especially 25, all of the zaviyas and tekkes were closed in Turkey. Madrasas were closed. Like, so it was not possible to use the Sufi tradition. Like having a Sufi order was illegal. And to claim to be a sheikh, you could be jailed and killed. Like practically it was not possible. But also Sayyid Nursi saw that like Sufism works when you already have Iman in your heart. Like honestly, you need it, because once you settle on your Iman, you're always dealing with the world. You gotta go into some spiritual, realms and practices. But without that, if you don't have faith, it collapses. That Kashf al-Qulub is all about advice, to believers, people who already believe. I read it. I was curious. What was the operation that Sayyid Nursi? I didn't feel that operation. Maybe my heart is too dark. But it was really, that was a bigger problem for Sayyid Nursi, because especially when you read the letters, you realize like one of his students sends him, and these are scholarly people too, by the way. They studied in madrasas. They're losing faith. And he goes, thank you very much for sending me that treatise about afterlife. It saved my faith. I was disillusioned. I was like drunk. I was going to hit my head to the walls. I read it. I felt faith enter into my heart. Because I cannot thank you enough. You can see the guy's crying in the letter. Like you see all these, I think it was, he just saw that that Sufi path was not the way to go in his time. Probably we need it now a little bit, but again, it comes down to if you want to follow it, you have to do it in a traditional way, follow someone whether they are properly can guide you is another problem. And
there's also that whole discussion on the Sufi path and the tasawwuf concepts, and we see the tasawwuf concepts being discussed.
But I really think there's an in-between, like Sufism, and that's really high elite. Like Islam does give really foundational spiritual teachings, like gratitude, for example. Like this year, at the beginning of the year, I said to myself, I'm going to make gratitude central thing for me this year. I actually realized I'm not practicing it. Yeah, I'm saying Alhamdulillah after I eat and I thank people, but I don't truly feel, I realize I don't truly feel grateful. It hasn't become part of my character. And then I said to myself, every day I'm going to identify 3 things that I'm going to be grateful about. And if possible, unique things. And honestly, I was astounded by the effect that it had. And a lot of things we miss during the everyday to be grateful about. It completely changed my spiritual outlook and inner state. Just doing that, like we don't need these advanced like spiritual concepts, explanations. So we just need to go back to the basics. I'm actually planning to do a series on this. I've identified 10 very important teachings in the Quran, spiritual teachings, that I want to, inshallah, talk about.
Well, speaking of gratitude, we're very grateful for having you here, Professor Mehmet, and inshallah we'll have more of you. I want to close it, but Imam Baitul is insisting that he wants to ask it.
This question is coming from Instagram Live from Toronto University. Dr. Albert Frollo asking, he says, but cannot Nursi be called like Sheikh Gulen, a Sufi on his own way?
Call Gulen as a Sufi?
Yeah, no,
Nursi.
Nursi, okay.
It's on the own way.
Look, I have grappled with this and thought really hard. What is Said Nursi really Sufi? I believe that he covers covers all of the spiritual teachings of Islam that Islamic tradition has produced, like based on Quran, Sunnah, and let's say Sufism. He incorporates it into a reasonable framework and within Islamic theology. He combines everything together. And in doing so, he takes it as far as he can to stay within that Quranic, boundary. And there are many places where he says, I have to stop here, or I cannot go any further, I'm not allowed to go further, interestingly. Like we see that he's hitting that boundary and stopping. I even said this to one of my students who was explaining Risale-i Nur in a highly spiritual way and bringing other things. I said, look, you don't need to do that. Said Nursi has already done it as far as he can do it. Like you're really introducing something else here, which I don't think is right. I guess, you can, I'm not limiting like spirituality or theology to what Said Nursi wrote, but honestly, he has taken it as far as you can go in terms of spiritual. And beyond that, it's just speculation, subjectivity, and I guess, anything can happen.
Maybe you might suggest people to read his biography and make their own judgments. I mean,
yeah,
someone who's had
read
28 poison attempts on him and he survives that and spends his whole night on a tree. And we know his Awrad and Askar, 3 volumes, Majma' Tasab. To not call him a Sufi in his own way might be difficult as well.
He's highly spiritual man. Like he would worship God 3 hours a day. He would do dhikr 3 hours a day. Like live a life of poverty, like absolute zuhd and taqwa. Like his students knew him as a saint, and he's got a lot of these karama type occurrences as well. Just wanted to, I guess, I'm really reluctant to call him a Sufi because that brings it, but he's highly spiritual. He does benefit from Sufism because like tasawwuf is part of Islamic tradition. We can't deny that. But he cannot be locked into one discipline, I feel. He's too original.
One tariqa.
Yeah. I just realized I didn't answer Zuleyha's second question. Have I had any intellectual challenges? Maybe I'll just quickly
Maybe in
respond.
summary, because I feel the qurbiyah of the food.
Qurabiyya.
Aqrabiyah.
Yeah. Honestly, I haven't had any challenges. It was just a pure pleasure for me to work on this. I loved it, and I really felt I did it in a way that I felt I'm contributing something original, in a sense that bringing the Said Nursi's writings with classical Islamic theology and making that available for contemporary audience in a way. I guess it's a finished meal that you can read and benefit from, there are issues where I'm still challenged intellectually, like the problem of eternity, or the causality is not finished yet. I think there's still things to be discussed there. This issue of free will, I'm actually planning to look into that like scientifically and like look at, because some of the explanations of classic scholars were based on their knowledge of science in those times. Like they were saying, when you get cold, you shiver, so therefore you don't have control over your bodies. Like very simple observations and things like that. They built conclusions. But we now know neuroscience. We can enter the brain and really do a lot of, there's a lot of knowledge there. I think we can update our theological understandings with what we know now, and hopefully that could be a contribution of this generation.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mehmet Ozalp, and also these initiatives on free will, but also the museum that's happening in Australia. We heard about that.
Yes.
First museum, inshallah. We look forward. Hopefully in the future we'll have you here again. I think As you can tell by the questions, answers, we're very interested. And our conversations can continue as we discuss the Risale-i Nur meal and also the other meal, inshallah.
I understand you will pass the link to the book, inshallah, to audience.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have a chance to,
hopefully.
I don't know if there's not many books because you've brought some, if there can be some sort of ordering or I'm not sure the details actually, Dr. Halim is, and also maybe
I will leave one of them with the center as a gift, inshallah.
All right, one of them you can sign for the center then, inshallah.
No worries.
Okay. Thank you very much for everyone. Assalamu alaikum.